The morning I found out, I was standing at my kitchen counter with a mug of coffee I never ended up drinking. My daughter called at 7:43. I remember because I had just looked at the clock, thinking she never called this early, thinking something must be wrong. I answered on the second ring. She didn't say hello. She went straight into it, the way she always did when she had rehearsed something and was afraid of losing her nerve. She said the wedding was going to be smaller than they planned. Intimate. Just immediate family and close friends. She said she and Nathan had talked it over and they thought it would be better cleaner, she said. She actually used the word cleaner if I didn't come. I stood there holding my phone, and the word just sat in my chest like a stone. I asked her to say it again. Not because I didn't hear her. I heard every syllable. I just needed a moment before I had to accept that those words had actually come out of my daughter's mouth and been directed at me. She repeated it. A little impatient this time. Like I was making things difficult on purpose. I didn't cry on the phone. I don't know how I managed that. I said okay. I said I understood. I said I hoped she would be happy. And then I set the phone face down on the counter, and I stood very still for a long time, looking out the window at the backyard, at the bird feeder I had hung out there the spring after my husband passed, at the garden beds that needed turning over before the first frost came. The coffee went cold. I never drank it. My name is Margaret. I am 63 years old. I spent 31 years as a registered nurse, most of them in the oncology ward at St. Catherine's, which means I have sat with people at the hardest moments of their lives, and I know something about what it means to hold yourself together when everything inside you is falling apart. I thought I was good at it. I thought I had built up some kind of armor over the years. All those long shifts, all those difficult conversations with families in waiting rooms. I was not prepared for my own daughter to tell me I was not wanted at her wedding. Claire is 34. She grew up in the same house where I still live, the small yellow house on Birchwood Lane that her father and I bought the year she was born. We didn't have much. Her father drove a delivery truck and I worked nights for most of her childhood so we could afford the mortgage and her school clothes and the field trips she never had to miss. We scraped. There were years we really scraped. But she never went without anything she needed, and most of what she wanted, too. She was smart, sharper than either of us, if I'm being honest. She got scholarships, went to a university 3 states away, graduated with honors, got a job at a consulting firm in the city. I was proud of her in a way that felt almost too big to contain. I told everyone, I was that mother. I put her graduation photo on the refrigerator and it is still there. Somewhere along the way, though, and I cannot point to the exact moment, I have tried, she started treating her childhood like something to be explained away rather than remembered. When she brought Nathan home the first time, 2 years before the wedding, I made a pot roast and bought good wine and cleaned the house until it shone. Nathan was polite. He shook my hand. He looked around the living room with this expression I recognized but couldn't quite name then. Later, I would understand it. But that first evening, I just thought he was quiet, reserved, the way some young men are when they meet their girlfriend's family. After they left, Claire called me. She said the evening went well. Then she paused and said, almost carefully, that she and Nathan ran in certain circles now, that his family had expectations, that she hoped I would understand. I said, of course. I didn't understand at all, but I said of course because she was my daughter, and I wanted things to be easy for her. The visits got shorter after that. The calls got shorter. She stopped mentioning his family. When I asked about the engagement, they had announced it on social media before she called me. I saw it on my phone while I was eating breakfast alone. She talked about the venue and the flowers and the guest list, but never about me being there, I assumed. I should not have assumed. I kept the phone call to myself for nearly 2 weeks. I didn't tell my sister. I didn't tell my friend Pauline from church, who had known Claire since she was in pigtails. I folded the whole thing up and put it somewhere quiet inside myself, the way you learn to do when you work with grief long enough. And I went about my days. Then one Thursday afternoon, I drove to the grocery store on Elm, the one I have been shopping at for 20 years. And I saw a woman in the cereal aisle who looked how I felt. She was about my age, maybe a few years older, with silver hair pulled back and reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, standing very still in front of a shelf of oatmeal, like she had forgotten what she came for. She had that look I knew from work, the look of someone who is functioning on the outside while something has stopped working on the inside. I don't usually talk to strangers. I am friendly, but I respect people's privacy. Something made me stop. I said, "Are you all right?" She looked at me like she was coming back from somewhere far away. She said yes. She was fine, just tired. Then she looked at my face and seemed to decide something, and she said, "Actually, no, she was not fine." Her name was Diane. She had driven to this particular grocery store because it was far from her neighborhood, far from anyone she knew, because she needed to get out of her house and she didn't want to run into anyone who would ask how she was doing. We ended up sitting in the little cafe corner near the front of the store for almost 2 hours with cups of bad coffee between us. Her story was not the same as mine, but the shape of it was familiar enough that more than once I felt the back of my throat tighten. Diane's son was named Nathan. I looked at her when she said the name. She said, "My son Nathan is getting married next month to a lovely girl named Claire." We sat with that for a moment. She said Nathan had called her the week before with what he called a practical suggestion. The wedding, he said, was going to be elegant, sophisticated. He and Claire wanted a certain atmosphere. He told his mother that he thought it might be easier for everyone if she attended a small family dinner the night before rather than the ceremony itself. He said it gently. He said he hoped she understood. He had booked her a room at a hotel 40 minutes from the venue. She told him she understood. She hung up the phone and sat in her car in her own driveway for 45 minutes because she couldn't make her legs carry her back inside her house. I looked across that little cafe table and I thought, here we are. The 2 women our children were so embarrassed by that they couldn't even put us in the same room. Diane had raised Nathan on her own after his father left when the boy was 9. She had worked 2 jobs for most of his teenage years. She had a strong laugh and reading glasses that kept sliding down her nose, and she wore a cardigan that was slightly too big for her, and she was one of the most dignified people I had met in a long time. We talked about our children the way you can only talk about them with someone who will not judge you for the complicated feelings underneath the love, because the love was still there. That was the hardest part. If the love had gone out, it would have been simpler. But it hadn't. It sat right next to the hurt and the confusion and the quiet shame of wondering what you had done or not done or been. At some point, Diane said, "I keep asking myself if I did something wrong. I keep going back over everything, looking for the moment." I said, "I do too." She said, "I don't think there was a moment." I said, "No, I don't think there was either." We were quiet for a while. The store hummed around us, muzak and shopping carts and the beep of registers. Then Diane set down her coffee cup and said, "I have been to exactly 3 events in Nathan's adult life where I was allowed to sit in the front." I asked what the other 2 were. She said his college graduation and the time he broke his ankle playing tennis, and she was the emergency contact. I laughed before I could help it. She laughed too. It was the kind of laugh that has a little bit of crying in it, but it was still a laugh. We exchanged numbers before we left. We hugged in the parking lot. She drove away, and I sat in my car for a moment, looking at her name in my phone, thinking about what the world was doing, what we had come to. Over the next 2 weeks, we texted. Small things, at first. She sent me a photo of a soup she had made. I sent her a photo of the bird feeder, 2 cardinals on it at once. We talked on the phone twice, long calls that meandered through our whole lives, our children and our late husbands, and the years of working, and the specific loneliness of getting older in a country that is always pointing toward the young. I told my sister about the wedding. She was furious, in the way only someone who loves you very much can be furious, hot and protective, and wanting to do something about it. I told her there was nothing to do. She said there was always something to do. I didn't know yet what I was going to do. The wedding was on a Saturday in October, a place called Halcyon Estate, about an hour from where I live. I knew the venue. Claire had shown me photos 8 months ago, her eyes bright, describing the chandeliers and the stone terrace and the vineyard view. She had been happy showing me those photos. I had been happy looking at them. I had imagined myself there in something navy, maybe, or a deep burgundy, watching my daughter walk down an aisle and thinking about all the years it took to get to that moment. That was before. Diane called me on the Wednesday before the wedding. She had not been sleeping well. She said she had been sitting with the hotel confirmation in her inbox, trying to make herself feel okay about it, trying to tell herself that what mattered was that her son was happy, that the day was his, that a good mother stepped back. Then she said, "But I don't believe that anymore." I said, "I never did." She was quiet for a second. Then she said, "What if we went?" I didn't answer right away. She said, "Not to make a scene, not to ruin anything, just to be there, just to exist in the same room as our children on the day they get married, which is something I believe we have earned the right to do." I said, "I think you're right." She said, "Will you come with me?" I sat in my kitchen where I had stood with the cold coffee 6 weeks ago, and I looked out at the bird feeder, and I thought about 31 years of night shifts, and a husband who died too young, and a yellow house on Birchwood Lane, and a graduation photo still on the refrigerator. I said yes. We drove together. Diane picked me up at 11. She was wearing a pearl gray dress and low heels, and she had done her hair nicely. I wore the navy, after all. We were 2 women in our 60s driving through the October countryside, with the leaves turning gold and orange on either side of the road, and we didn't talk much, but the silence was comfortable. It was the silence of people who have already said what needed saying. Halcyon Estate was beautiful. I will give Claire that. The stone facade and the oak trees and the rows of white chairs already filling with guests, the kind of guests who drove nice cars and wore expensive shoes and moved through the world with the ease of people who had never had to think too hard about money. I recognized Nathan's world immediately. I understood a little better, in that moment, why both our children had done what they did. I didn't forgive it, but I understood it more. We parked and sat in the car for a moment. Diane said, "Are we doing this?" I said, "We're doing this." We walked in together. I don't know if I can fully describe what it felt like. 2 older women walking through the entrance of an estate wedding, uninvited, without asking permission, without apology. My heart was hammering. I don't think my face showed it. Diane's face was perfectly calm, and I borrowed some of her calm and held it in front of me like a shield. A young woman with a clipboard looked up at us at the door. She said, Diane said, "We're family of the bride and groom." The young woman looked at her clipboard, looked back at us, and then glanced over her shoulder at the growing crowd. She made a decision the way overwhelmed people at events make decisions. She smiled and waved us through. We found 2 seats near the back. Not in the front row. Not the front 2 rows that had been left for close family, people who had apparently passed some kind of test we had failed. We sat in the back, and we were there. When Claire walked down the aisle, I saw her. She was beautiful. She wore her grandmother's pearl earrings, my mother's pearl earrings, the ones I had given her 3 birthdays ago, and her dress was simple and elegant, and she was holding a small bouquet of white roses, and her face was full of the kind of happiness that nothing should have the right to touch. I felt my eyes fill. I didn't try to stop them. She didn't see me until after the ceremony. They were doing the receiving line, and Diane and I had hung back, not joining the line, just standing near the edge of the terrace. And then Claire looked up from greeting a guest, and our eyes met across the crowd. She went still. I watched her face move through several things quickly. Surprise, something that might have been anger, then something harder to read. Nathan had found his mother by then. I watched him see Diane, and I watched his expression do the same journey. He was holding Claire's hand. Both our children stood there holding hands and looking at us, and the October sun was very warm for the time of year, and somewhere a string quartet was playing. I did not walk toward Claire. I let her come to me. It took her a few minutes. She said something to Nathan, and he said something back, and they separated, and she moved through the crowd toward where I was standing. She stopped a few feet away. She said, "Mom." I said, "Hello, sweetheart." She said, "How did you?" I said. Diane drove. She looked at Diane, then back at me. She said, "This wasn't what we planned." I said, "I know." And then I said, quietly, because this was not the moment for a scene, and I did not want a scene, I said, "I have been your mother for 34 years. I worked nights for a decade so you could have what you needed. I sat with your father when he was dying, and I called you every step of the way, and you flew home, and I held your hand through that too. I am not asking for a front row seat. I am not asking for a speech or a toast or a moment in your photographs. I am only asking to be allowed to exist in the same building as you on one of the most important days of your life. I think I have earned that much." My voice did not shake. I was glad of that. Claire looked at me for a long moment. There were things moving across her face that I couldn't read, layers of it, years of it. Then her eyes went glassy, and she pressed her lips together, and she took one step forward and put her arms around me. She didn't say anything. She just held on, the way she used to when she was small, before she decided that her small beginnings were something to be ashamed of. I held her back. I breathed in the scent of her hair. Expensive now. Salon shampoo and something floral. But underneath it, still her, still my daughter who fell asleep on my shoulder watching movies on Friday nights when she was 7 years old. We were not fixed in that moment. I want to be honest about that. You don't fix 34 years and the specific sadness of being erased by someone you love in one hug on a stone terrace in October. But something loosened. Something that had been locked up tight in both of us came open a little, just enough to let some air in. Beside me, I heard Diane say Nathan's name, soft and even. Later, during the reception, Diane and I sat at a table near the back that had not been assigned to us, and someone brought us plates of food, and no one asked us to leave. Nathan came and sat with his mother for almost 20 minutes, the two of them with their heads close together, talking quietly. I don't know what was said. It wasn't mine to know. Claire found me again near the end of the evening. The dancing had started and the lights were low and warm and the whole place smelled like autumn flowers and candle wax. She sat down next to me, and we watched the guests on the dance floor for a while without talking. She said, "I thought if I could just get through this day without any complications, everything would be easier after." I said, "I understand why you thought that." She said, "I think I was wrong about a lot of things." I said, "You probably were?" "I probably was too." She looked at me. She said, "I was embarrassed, Mom, of where I came from, of the house and I don't know how to explain it." I said, "You don't have to explain it. I know what it feels like to want to be seen as something more than where you started." She said, "You do?" I said, "Everyone does, Claire. But there's a difference between building something new and burning down what was there before." She was quiet. I said, "Your grandmother's earrings look beautiful." She touched her ear. She smiled, just a little. She said, "I almost didn't wear them." I said, "I'm glad you did." Diane drove me home around 11. The roads were dark and quiet and the heater hummed in her car. We were tired in the good way. The way you're tired after something that cost you something but was worth it. She said, "Do you think it changes anything?" I thought about it honestly before I answered. I said, I don't know. Maybe not everything, but something. She nodded. I said, I think the worst thing would have been not going. I think we would have spent the rest of our lives wondering. She said, yes, I think you're right about that. When she dropped me off at the yellow house on Birchwood Lane, she squeezed my hand before I got out. I squeezed back. I went inside and turned on the kitchen light and stood for a moment in the quiet. The bird feeder was dark outside the window. The graduation photo was on the refrigerator. The same house, the same rooms, but something in the air felt different, like a window had been cracked open somewhere. I made myself a cup of tea this time, and I drank the whole thing. Some people will tell you that a good mother stays invisible when her children ask her to. Some people will say that love means never making the person you love uncomfortable, never taking up space they didn't leave for you, never showing up where you weren't told to. I disagree with that. I think love sometimes means showing up anyway, not loudly, not to cause damage, but steadily, quietly. The way you showed up for 30 years of ordinary Tuesdays and sick days and school mornings, and every unwitnessed thing that nobody makes speeches about. You cannot build a life on pretending your beginning didn't happen. The woman who scrubbed the floors and worked the night shift and stretched the grocery money and held your hand at the hospital, she didn't disappear just because you moved somewhere nicer. She's still in you. She's in the way you keep your word and the way you don't quit and the way you knew, even when you were trying to push her away, that she would come. I don't know what happens next with Claire and me. I am trying not to need it to look a certain way. I know she is trying too, in her own manner, at her own pace. She texted me the Sunday after the wedding. She said she was thinking about me. She said she would call that week. She did call. It was a short call, a little careful. The way conversations are when you're rebuilding something, feeling for the cracks. Diane and I still talk. We have plans to have lunch at a place she likes in her part of town. A Vietnamese restaurant she says is the best she's ever been to. I told her I would try anything once. She laughed. I think she's someone I will know for a long time. There's a particular kind of loneliness that comes when your children grow into people you don't entirely recognize. When the distance between who they are and who you raise them to be feels like an accusation, like an answer to a question you didn't know you were asking about yourself. I have felt that loneliness. I imagine I will feel it again. But I also know this. I sat in the back row of my daughter's wedding with another mother who had been handed the same quiet humiliation, and we wore our good dresses, and we went anyway, and we were there for the ceremony and the music and the low gold lights, and nobody can take that from us now. It happened. We were in the room, and if Claire is ever, someday, a mother herself, if she stands over a small sleeping face and feels the weight of what that means, I hope she remembers. I hope she remembers that her mother came.